For Veterans Only is a national television news magazine for America's veterans and a presentation of Veterans Productions USA. Reporting for Veterans Only is Brian Patrick.
We often hear Vietnam veterans got a raw deal from the government and the American public compared with their World War II counterparts. Does this make the Vietnam veteran the exception? Well, there are some startling conclusions on this topic in a new book. And Mary Miller caught up with the authors when they recently accepted an award from the American Legion. Mary has this report from Washington.
The book is called The Wages of War, published in hardcover a year ago and now out in paperback. It's the only book that documents the treatment of America's veterans since the Revolution that gave birth to the nation more than 200 years ago. The way the project got started was New York Times award-winning reporter Richard Severo wrote a series of articles on Agent Orange back in the late 70s. One of his sources for information was attorney Lewis Milford, who at the time represented Vietnam and other veterans in problems with the government. They were appalled at what they found.
Well, I was struck by the indifference of the Veterans Administration. I mean, I've never seen people behave like that before toward people who had served their country. I had no idea that this was going on. I always thought the Veterans Administration was supposed to represent the interests of veterans. I'm a very simple person, a very old-fashioned person. The first day that I went there, the interview that I had, I mean, the official that I spoke to said that soldiers needed something to blame their problems on, and ascribed, said Agent Orange was nothing, just ascribed it all to a figment of their imaginations. And he had no basis to say that. That's what struck me, because the epidemiological study, the science had not been done for him to say that.
We felt that there was an obligation to study it, that the government's obligation was not to say no, but it was to do a fair job for veterans. Essentially, it was to find out the truth, to find out if there were problems that were connected to exposure to Agent Orange. And what was very disappointing is that for almost a year, the government had said no compensation, that there's no problem, without having looked at it.
Milford and Severo say the government was finally pressured into looking at the problem and doing a series of studies on Agent Orange, but did them so badly they provided nothing more than another excuse to avoid paying compensation. And they say Vietnam veterans were shortchanged in other ways, too.
Well, their GI Bill rights were less than were available after World War II. I mean, their homecoming, there was none, certainly. They were faced with very bad economic times facing the war, and we simply didn't prepare at all.
The author's research had a sobering effect.
And over a period of months and years, we became very, very upset at what was happening to Vietnam veterans. And I should say here that neither of us is a veteran. And I didn't think the war in Vietnam was a very good idea when it was fought, and neither did Lou. We had no particular axe to grind. But we never confused the war in Vietnam with the people who volunteered or were conscripted to fight it.
That outrage made Severo and Milford wonder if the Vietnam veteran was the exception. Particularly, they say, since Americans' collective case of historical amnesia makes us think the proud homecoming of the World War II vet was the norm. The resulting book offers a new and disturbing perspective. The World War II vet was the exception, the Vietnam vet the norm. The authors cite a series of examples, starting with the Revolutionary War veterans.
They were not paid. And when they came home in the summer of 1783, merchants were asking them for hard currency. They had no hard currency. You remember the revolution was fought with British pound sterling. So small claims courts started to seize the farms of veterans. And lots of veterans who were heroes of the American Revolution died in debtor's prison. Veterans and farmers in Western Massachusetts said, we've got to stop this. So they started to go into small claims courts in Western Massachusetts to stop them from sitting. They would literally physically remove the judge from the court, you see, because if the court didn't sit, their property couldn't be seized. Well, that didn't set well with Governor James Bowdoin of Massachusetts, who formed an army to crush them.
The confrontation became known as Shays' Rebellion, named after the veterans' leader Daniel Shays. Well, then came the War of 1812. This marked the first time the idea of public assistance surfaced, with the government feeling it had an obligation to provide for those who could not provide for themselves. But Milford says the feeling was supported by only half-hearted action.
In very flush times after that war, the benefits were quite generous. But as we faced a recession, as we frequently do now, that was in 1819, many were just lopped from the rolls, lopped from the veterans' pension rolls. And they had to protest to get back on those rolls, had to protest to get the benefits that they thought they had after that war.
For the veterans of the Civil War, the problem was unemployment.
They were consistently discriminated against in the workplace. It was so bad that in New York City, Union veterans were taking out ads in newspapers, begging for work. There were no laws to prevent discrimination against veterans, and these guys were just reminders of the divisions of the past. So, you know, their plight as the 19th century wore on, their plight became quite desperate. Not only did the government not do anything for these guys, but by the turn of the century, they were blaming the veterans for spreading drug abuse in this country. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. After the Civil War, during the war, they used to sprinkle morphine on the wounds of veterans because it was the only painkiller that they had. And a lot of those soldiers became addicted to morphine as a result. So by the turn of the century, when a lot of veterans, middle-aged veterans, were addicted, they began to talk of morphine as soldier's disease and started to blame veterans for what was happening to people who had not been veterans.
By the end of the century, American soldiers were back at war, but for the first time off American shores, in a tropical climate, supporting Cuba's rebellion against Spanish control. And what happened to those Spanish-American War veterans, say the authors, was a travesty.
When those soldiers returned with yellow fever and malaria, what the government told them was that those sicknesses were really a result of homesickness or nostalgia or other things completely unrelated to war. And also when they returned, they were stuck away in an encampment on the end of Long Island in what is now the resort of Montauk Point, and there proceeded to die with increasing numbers. And they were also isolated by those who lived near them. At the time, the Hamptons were a new resort in the end of Long Island and they wanted to attract business. And people there were very upset that soldiers from that war, the very victorious war, were placed on the end of the island because it might destroy the tourist trade in the end of the island. So what happened is that those people were treated terribly badly, died on trains, tried to leave surreptitiously to come to New York City to get care in hospitals in New York. And we ended that period of time really in disgrace. It was an unpopular war in some ways, much like Vietnam. And there were questions, again, I think, very much like Vietnam, of confusing the warrior with the war. And they were the warriors of a war that some thought should not have been fought.
World War I veterans faced enormous readjustment problems of their own.
Woodrow Wilson did no planning for veterans. They came home, no jobs were guaranteed them, there were no loans, they did not have any funds for college education or anything like that. So they did not share in the prosperity of the 20s, were hardest hit when the stock market crashed in 29, and you remember they marched on Washington in 1932, in the summer of 32, because they wanted a bonus for their service. That was the dreadful summer in which Herbert Hoover and Douglas MacArthur somehow arrived at the extraordinary conclusion that the veterans, the 30 or 40,000 veterans who were in Washington, were radicals and thieves who were out to topple the government of the United States. I mean, it's the most preposterous notion that one could consider. Well, they were driven out of Washington at bayonet point. They were tear gassed. It was one of the darkest chapters, it seems to me, in the history of American veterans.
But if that was one of the darkest chapters, the experience of World War II veterans was by far the brightest. They were honored, respected, and comparatively well cared for. The biggest triumph was the passage of the first GI Bill of Rights. Even so, the vote was a squeaker and prevailed only with a push from the American Legion.
They spent $50 billion on the GI Bill of Rights, which the World War II veterans have more than paid back. I mean, they are just so successful. They took out loans, they bought houses and cars, they sent their kids to college, they became the backbone of the middle class, now they're going into the retirement. They have been among our most productive citizens.
Well, then came the Korean War. According to the authors, another sorry scenario for its veterans.
We found ourselves with thousands of soldiers in prisoner of war camps. What our government said happened in those prisoner of war camps is that the soldiers were brainwashed and had not served honorably. And in fact said that a third of them had turned communist. What we found ourselves is that with soldiers returning from those prisoner of war camps, many of them had been killed, tortured, starved, found themselves accused of being communists. I mean, a quite remarkable conclusion. None of the evidence proved that, and we outline that in the book. But nevertheless, what we were looking for after Korea, which some would say was the first war we ever lost, was a scapegoat. And the scapegoats we found were the soldiers who fought the war.
The big question in all this is why? Since America has always placed an enormous premium on winning her wars, why, when it's all over, do we seem to care so little for those who fought them? The authors offer some answers. First, there's the government.
Government never has wanted to pay the wages of war. Not in 200 years have they wanted to pay the human cost of war. They want to save money. They can't save money on defense contractors. I mean, they have to spend $600 for toilet seat covers. You remember all of that. They can bail out the savings and loan associations. They can bail out Chrysler. I mean, the government always finds the money to do the things that it feels that it has to do. But when it comes to paying the guys who have fought our wars, it is something where they feel, where zealots in government, who are supposed to be representing the interests of veterans, feel that somehow this is a place to save money.
And if we actually tallied up the costs of all wars past, the real costs, the costs in health damage, the psychological costs, the cost of the country, we probably would think more than twice before we pursue another war. And in some sense, I think that may be one of the main reasons why we don't do it. It will make that much harder to do the next time around.
Then there is often an uncaring, ambivalent public.
People want to put war behind them. I mean, when war is over, you see it time and time again, well, let's just get back to what we were doing before. And they forget about the people who fought the war.
I think we're somewhat schizophrenic as a society about war, and I think there's something about that. That is that all too often we rush into war as a country, but then once we see the consequences of it, it reminds us of perhaps the moral qualms we have about war. We don't raise those questions early, and then when they face us after, the way I think we frequently try to put the war behind us, that is to sort of forget what we did as a war, what we did as a country to make war, is to put those veterans aside as well.
And, say the authors, contrary to what many may think, veterans have never really pushed much for themselves.
Veterans have traditionally had a lot of pride in their service and have not wanted to ask for anything. They've asked for very little, really. Secondly, government has too easily used the press to make veterans feel guilty about asking for help.
So if neither a government, the public, nor veterans themselves have managed to get a country to pay the real wages of war over 200 years, what's the chance things will change in the future? The authors hope their book is the answer.
We need a memory. We need to remember. The reason why we have not dealt well with veterans of each succeeding war is that we've forgotten how badly they've been treated before. We have to have that sense of history. Without it, we continue to make the same mistakes.
They give up their freedom for us. They're the only group of Americans who do that. They're not just people who work for a living and do the right thing, but they give up something that, in my opinion, is even more precious than life itself, which is freedom. And they do this to support national objectives at a given point in history. And if we can't meet our commitments to them, then we are not honorable, we are not ethical, we are not moral. And this country considers itself honorable, ethical, and moral. This country is founded on those principles.
The Wages of War took 7 years to write, from information gathered through interviews, letters, documents, studies, books. You may not believe what you read, you may not like what you read, but it will surely give you pause to think. In Washington, I'm Mary Miller for Veterans Only.
Many of our military victories can be credited to American air power. But now a lot of those old planes are gone or in museums, but not all of them. Mike Victor has the story of the warbirds, the flyers, and their determination to stay airborne.
Hellcats and Avengers, Spitfires and Hurricanes. The smell, grease and fuel. The sound, pumping pistons and feathering props. Tens of thousands experienced the 1990 Warbird Air Show at the Kennedy Space Center Airport in Titusville, Florida. The stars, hundreds of battle-tested veterans, men and machines, all with gallant records over Europe and the Pacific. The annual show is held by the Valiant Air Command, an organization working to find and preserve historic military aircraft. Known as an educational flying museum, the VAC believes the true history involved with these planes can only be expressed when the aircraft are flown for the public to see.
It just brings back fond memories. There's nothing like a warbird with the smell, the gas, the hydraulic fluid. It's just different. And you never lose sight of what it was like.
To many of these veterans, planes like this symbolize the fighting spirit of American aviation. But the men and women who rebuild them and fly them have left the wars behind. And for them, these planes are now the ultimate plaything.
We'd like to have the boat that George Washington came across the Delaware in so that I could show that to my kids, but at least I'll have this. And I have enough backing to put that together, and they'll have it forever.
It's a life's expectation, and you probably work on it more than you do fly it. However, it's a North American, made by the North American Corporation back in the late 30s. This one in particular, a 1943 AT-6G. It was the last in a series of the North American T-6s that was built for North America.
Florida Space Coast residents are used to seeing unusual machines in the air, but flying boats? And flying boxcars? Georgia Box is actually an old C-119 Fairchild, designed like something never meant to fly. Some said it inspired the Enterprise of Star Trek fame. Having achieved fame of its own, the P-51 Mustang showed why it is revered by so many veterans. Air show profits are used to award scholarships to aviation students. Preserving this history is becoming tougher. The supply of old aircraft is ever decreasing through attrition and overseas sales. Also decreasing, trained pilots and mechanics to care for these relics.
I wish we'd have saved more of them, though. The government should have kept about a dozen of every vintage.
How long are you going to work with them?
Well, I've only been flying about 56 years, 52 years, I guess, to be exact.
Just can't quite remember, can you?
No, it's my hobby, and I get paid for it all my life.
There's a lot of work. I spend about 40 hours on this airplane for every hour as I fly. It's my hobby, and they get as much care and attention as any airliner, believe me.
In its early years, the B-24 Liberator regularly heard the sound of ack-ack guns. Now it hears only cheers and applause. Coke Stewart and his plane stand as a reminder of the war contribution of our 41st president.
Well, what you're looking at X-2, which is a model of the airplane that our president, George Bush, flew during World War II.
George Bush's flight assignment aboard his TBM Avenger on September the 2nd, 1944, almost meant his death.
And they attacked a power station on the island of Chichijima. And coming off the target, the airplane was hit by a ground fire, set the wing on fire, and Lieutenant Bush was urged to bail out. And he kept climbing for altitude, trying to get his crew out of there. They saw a streamer come out the back door, and Bush bailed out. 2 or 3 miles off the coast, the Japanese gunboats came for him. He thought that he was a goner. A periscope popped up, and then he knew that he was dead because there weren't any U.S. submarines. The submarine pops up, and somebody hollers, "Hey, Mac, get over here quick, we got to go." Turns out it was the USS Finback, submarine that was on a secret mission into Tokyo Bay, and it had a documentary film crew on it.
After his unusual underwater mission, Bush returned to his carrier to continue bombing runs on the Japanese. And now, the old warbirds show they still have what it takes to hit the target.
I've seen airplanes take off at the airport, but nothing like this. It's real neat. I like it, old airplanes. My dad and his friends own a museum up in Cartersville, Georgia.
Thrills for the kids, nostalgia for the veterans, and camaraderie for all. The Warbird Air Show is an opportunity to reflect on the spirit of the men and women represented by these historic aircraft.
We worked very hard and very long just to launch one time. We bring it back down, and we worked very hard to clean it all up, get it ready to go again.
Those are old planes. Do you have any worry, any concern going up in the air, planes that old?
Well, not really. We've been around the airplane so long that you can spot any defects usually pretty closely, and if an airplane is ragtag, to leave it alone. If it's good mechanical shape, go to it. Have fun.
Without the dedicated mechanics, the old planes would never fly again. Keeping this Goonie bird aloft has become a full-time hobby for Frank Fleck.
Well, I started when I was 18 during World War II in England. I worked for 3 years on them, and then I got away from them. I was an automotive engineer all my life. Now that I've retired, I can go back to my first love, and that kind of makes me feel 20 years old all over again.
It's always fun. It brings back a lot of nostalgia from Vietnam, and the main thing is I get a lot of people together, and we have fun with the people. Everybody gets together, all the friends, and they socialize. We have barbecues out here, we have work parties, and it's a very good social gathering. Everybody has what they call spirit de corps.
Just for contrast, some newer models were allowed to perform. The Harrier, a big jet that can park anywhere. And the Thunderbolt shows off why they call it the Tank Buster. But it was the early models most came to see, some doing anything for just a ride aboard the classics.
You with the plane?
No, but I'm a flight crew. Well, my friend's dad's brother is the pilot of the plane.
And you're a flight crew. What do you do in the flight crew?
Just ride on it mostly.
Yeah?
Yeah.
It's fantastic. The nostalgia and everything. It's what it's all about. It's sort of a show and tell thing.
The Warbirds now fly peacefully into the 90s. The veterans at the controls are full of hope, knowing they and their machines have combined to help bring on this new era of peace. In Titusville, Florida, Mike Victor reporting for Veterans Only.
Next week on For Veterans Only, coverage of a hearing on that controversial Centers for Disease Control cancer study that could affect so many veterans. Also, a progress report on judicial review, and some important information from Dennis West on eligibility for veterans benefits. I'm Brian Patrick. Thanks for being with us. We hope you'll join us next time on For Veterans Only.
Share For Veterans Only with your friends and other veterans. A VHS copy of this week's program is available for $24.95, including postage and handling. To order your copy of For Veterans Only, call toll-free 1-800-874-VETS. That's 1-800-874-VETS. You can charge your order on Visa or MasterCard, or you can pay by check or money order. To get For Veterans Only on VHS, call now, 1-800-874-VETS.
This program is made possible by the Disabled American Veterans, a nonprofit service organization of over 1 million wartime disabled veterans. By the VFW, the Veterans of Foreign Wars. VFW means Service to America's Veterans. By PVA, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, and PVA Sports, working for the best. And by Galaxy Tours, a world leader for national and international group travel. The producers thank this station and other public television stations for their assistance in making this program available. For Veterans Only is also telecast by the Armed Forces Radio and Television Service for the benefit of the men and women serving on active duty in our armed forces, at home and abroad.